The frost had been spreading for 3 years. I knew it by the candles first. They had always burned hot and steady in the great hall of Valdris, the way they burned in any Wolf King's keep, fed by the body warmth of 100 packmates breathing together in the same stone room, by the fires in the 6 deep hearths, by whatever it is that makes a wolf hall feel alive and warm even in the dead of a coastal winter. But in the 3rd month after the moon cult's priests had come and gone and left their mark on my chest, the candles began to shorten too fast. Not from drafts. The windows were sealed. They shortened because the air around me could not sustain them, because whatever warmth a flame needs in order to live, I was drawing it in and extinguishing it without meaning to. By the end of the 1st year, my pack did not gather in the great hall any more. They had not said so. No wolf in Valdris would say such a thing to their king's face, and I was still their king, still Revan of the Blackstone Keep, still the alpha who had held this coastal territory against 4 rival claims and 2 tide wars. But I saw it in the way they chose the outer corridors to cross from one wing to another instead of passing through the hall. I saw it in the way the younger wolves flinched when I moved too close, a flinch they covered quickly and cleanly because they were well trained and loyal, but a flinch nonetheless. The cold that came off my skin was not the cold of a winter morning. It was the cold of something wrong, something that should not exist inside a living body. The mark sat at the center of my chest, just below the collarbone. It was not large. From a distance it looked like a burn scar, dark and irregular against my skin, the kind of mark a man carries away from a bad fight or a worse fire. Up close it was something else entirely. It had texture, the way old ice has texture when you run your finger across it, ridged and strange, with edges that seemed to shift slightly depending on the light. My healers called it a seal. My high priestess, Aldris, called it a binding. The moon cult priests who had pressed it into my skin 3 years ago, during what I had believed was a diplomatic audience, and was in fact an assassination attempt dressed in ceremony, had called it a gift. They had wanted my territory. The frost seal, Aldris told me afterward, was designed to kill a wolf king slowly, not with violence, which could be answered with violence but with isolation. A wolf without warmth cannot hold a pack. A pack that cannot gather cannot hold land. In 10 years, perhaps 15, the cold would have done what 4 rival claims had not. Aldris had tried everything she knew how to try. She was not a woman who admitted the limits of her knowledge easily, and I respected her for the years she had spent refusing to admit them. She had worked the seal with moon water and root fire and old wolf-tongue prayers that I could hear through the walls of my chamber at midnight, low and rhythmic and exhausted. She had brought in 3 outside practitioners, 1 from the inland packs, 2 from across the eastern sea, women of real skill who had each looked at the mark on my chest, run their hands over it and gone pale, not from fear of me, from recognition of what they were dealing with. Moon cult seals of this weight were not common. They were not, said the 3rd woman before she left, breakable by ordinary means. Ordinary means, Aldris had repeated, standing in my hall on a winter morning with frost on the inside of the window glass. What does that leave us? The 3rd practitioner had given her a single answer before she climbed back on her horse and rode away into the coastal fog. She had said, "The only seal break that holds against moon cult work is a true mate's hand. Not a healer's hand, not a priestess's hand. A fated mate's, someone whose bond with the marked wolf is old enough and real enough to predate the seal, to exist underneath it, unchanged. If such a person placed their palm flat on the seal and did not pull away, the mark would either accept the bond and release, or it would do nothing because no fated mate existed, or because the one who did exist had not been found. My war council, when Aldris brought them this information, had looked at one another in the way men look at one another when they are deciding how to deliver a verdict they know the recipient will not enjoy. Counselor Draven, who was the eldest and had the least patience for delicacy, said it plainly. The Alpha King had no mate. He had refused every match his council had ever offered him, on the grounds that a fated bond either arrived or it did not, and he would not take a political match and call it something it wasn't. This, Draven said, with a tone that had taken him 30 years to perfect, was the consequence of that. I did not answer him. The frost on the window was spreading inward along the sill. That had been 8 months ago. Since then, Aldris had sent word to every coastal territory and several inland ones, asking whether any wolf reader, tide reader, seal keeper, or practitioner of any tradition had knowledge of a woman who might carry a fated bond to the king of Valdris. She had sent 37 letters. She had received 12 replies, all of them either negative or so vague as to be useless. She had not, she told me one morning with her jaw set in the way that meant she was still not finished trying, given up. 2 weeks after that conversation, she came to find me in my chamber. I was standing at the sea window. It was what I did in the mornings now when I could not sleep. I stood at the window that overlooked the cliffs and the water below, and I watched the tide. In 3 years the cold had not touched my mind, only my body and the air around it, and my mind was still the same one that had led 6 sea crossings and built this keep's eastern wall with my own hands in the year I turned 22. It was an active mind. It found the cold around it deeply, profoundly wrong, and could not stop circling that wrongness the way a wolf circles a wound. So I stood at the window, and I watched the tide, because the tide at least was honest about what it was. "There is a woman at the gate," Aldris said. I did not turn around. Another healer. A tide reader. She came up the cliff path from the southern cove, apparently on foot. Steward Seth tried to send her away. She said she would wait. "What pack is she?" A pause that lasted slightly too long. "She doesn't appear to carry a pack mark, my king." I turned around then. Aldris was standing in my doorway with her hands folded in front of her, and her expression arranged in the careful neutral she wore when she was presenting me with information she anticipated I would object to. She was a small woman with gray-streaked hair and 26 years of serving this keep behind her, and I had learned to read her expressions the way I read tide charts, with attention to what they did not say as much as what they did. "A packless woman," I said. "A packless woman. Steward Seth's read on her is that she is a wanderer of some kind coastal, from the calluses on her hands and the salt in her hair. She says she reads tides. She says she knows what the mark on your chest is." Aldris paused again. "She says she has never been wrong about the sea." "That is not the same thing as knowing what a moon cult seal is." "No," Aldris agreed. "It is not." She waited. I looked back at the window. The tide below was coming in, the way it always came in on a north wind, fast and gray-green, and carrying pieces of something I couldn't identify from this height. For 3 years I had stood here in the mornings and catalogued the things the tide brought in. It was a strange habit for a wolf king. My council would have been appalled if they'd known, but the tide did not flinch when I stood near it. The tide came in without caring about the cold that came off my skin, and there was something in that I found necessary. "Bring her in," I said. I did not go to the great hall immediately. I stayed at the sea window long enough to hear the household settle back into its morning routines below, long enough for whatever composure I still possessed to reassemble itself, in the way it always had to reassemble when I was about to be in a room with people who had come to look at the mark on my chest and determine what it would do. I had been looked at for 3 years. I was tired of being looked at. But I was also standing in a room where the frost on the inner walls had crept a hand's breadth further than it had been yesterday, and that concentrated the mind. I came down the north stair and into the corridor that led to the hall. The cold came with me, the way it always came, not dramatically, not in visible breath clouds or visible ice, but in the way the air changed in my vicinity, the way wool did not feel warm and stone felt colder than it should. 2 of my household wolves passed me in the corridor, dipped their heads respectfully, and moved a little faster than they needed to. I did not hold it against them. They were not cowards. They were warm-blooded creatures, and the cold that came off me was wrong in a way that older instincts recognized and reacted to. I heard her before I came through the hall doorway. Not her voice, she wasn't speaking. I heard the absence of the usual morning hall sounds. No one moving, no low conversation between the fire tenders, the particular quality of silence that means everyone in a room has stopped what they were doing and is waiting. I recognized that silence. It was the one that gathered when something unexpected was happening, and no one was quite sure what to do about it. I came through the doorway. She was standing in the center of the hall, equidistant from the 3 nearest hearths, which were all burning low because the air in my hall did not sustain fires well anymore. She was not looking at the hearths or at the ceiling or at the gathering of household wolves along the walls who were very obviously trying not to stare at her. She was looking at the frost patterns on the floor. The hall floor was black stone, the same stone the whole keep was built of, quarried from the sea cliff itself when my grandfather had laid the foundations, and the frost spread across it in branching patterns from where I walked most often, reaching toward the walls in thin, pale lines that had taken 3 years to grow. She was studying them the way a navigator studies a chart, with her head tilted slightly to one side and her eyes moving in a systematic way that suggested she was reading something she already had a language for. Aldris was standing near the door to the east passage, her hands folded and her expression still neutral. Steward Seth was just behind her, looking aggrieved. The woman on the floor was, I noted this in the flat, automatic way I noted anything relevant, not what Seth's description had prepared me for. He had said packless and wandering and implied, in the way Seth implied things he considered beneath the keep's dignity, that she was therefore rough and probably poorly kempt. She was neither of these things. She wore a traveler's coat, heavy wool in a dark coastal blue that had seen a great deal of weather, and her boots were worn but well made. Her hair was dark and it was tangled from the sea wind, and she had not, apparently, taken the time to fix it before being brought in, and she did not seem particularly concerned about this. She was not young and not old, the way people who spend a great deal of time outdoors often appear neither. She had the kind of face that has been in weather and come through it, and is not particularly changed by the experience. She looked up when I came in. She did not flinch. I was accustomed to the flinch. Even from people who were trying hard not to show it, there was always a small adjustment in the body when I came too close, a pulling in, a stiffening, the involuntary reading of the wrong cold in the air near me. She did not do any of this. She looked at me with level dark eyes and then, unhurried, she looked back down at the floor frost and said, "The branching pattern goes northeast to southwest. That's the direction the curse is trying to spread. It follows your most used paths." Seth opened his mouth. Aldris put a very small hand on his arm and he closed it. "You read tides," I said. "And other currents." She crouched down and touched one of the frost lines with her fingertip. The frost did not recoil from her touch or spread toward it, it simply stayed, the way frost stays when a surface is already cold enough that another cold touch means nothing. A moon-cult seal of this weight will try to find its boundaries outward before it goes deeper. It's been 3 years. It should have gone deeper by now. She stood up. It hasn't. Something is holding it at the surface. The hall was very quiet. I said, "My high priestess has been working it." She glanced at Aldris, not her. "Something else." She looked back at me, and for the first time her gaze went to my chest, to where the mark sat beneath my shirt, invisible but present the way anything that wrong is present, the way a stone in a boot is present even when you can't see it. She did not linger. She moved her eyes back up to my face with the same unhurried directness and said, "May I see it?" Seth inhaled sharply. He had opinions about this suggestion. I could see them arranging themselves behind his face. Aldris said, before he could produce them, "I think we should hear what the woman has to say." I looked at the woman, at Sara, though I did not know her name yet, would not know it until she said it herself 20 minutes later when Aldris asked. I looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at me without performance, without the specific kind of professional composure that healers and practitioners wore in my presence like armor. The look that said I am not afraid because I have chosen not to be. She was simply not afraid. The distinction was small and it was enormous. Yes, I said. The room Aldris chose was the small one off the East Passage, a receiving room, not a great chamber, with a window that looked over the inner courtyard rather than the sea. There was a fire laid in the hearth, but it was burning poorly, the way all fires in my immediate vicinity burned poorly now. Aldris had brought a lamp as well, which gave better light than the hearth in any case. Seth had tried to remain. Aldris had managed him out of the room with the same small hand and one sentence in a very quiet voice, and the door closed behind him. The woman who read Tide stood by the window, looking at the inner courtyard, apparently content to wait. I pulled the laces of my shirt loose and drew the collar aside to expose the mark. She turned from the window and came to look at it. She did not touch it. She leaned in, close enough that I could smell the sea salt that seemed to have soaked itself permanently into her coat, and she looked at the mark the way she had looked at the frost patterns on the floor, systematically, reading left to right and then right to left, tilting her head slightly. The lamp threw warm light across the mark and I watched her face. She had a still face, the kind that does not broadcast conclusions before they are ready to be delivered. After a long moment she said, "How long did they take to put this in?" The audience was 3 hours. I had replayed it many times. The actual moment I felt the mark was the last 20 minutes. 20 minutes, she straightened up. A seal that takes 20 minutes to set is not meant to kill in 20 years. They were in a hurry. That's why it branched outward instead of going deep. She paused, looking at the middle distance in the way of someone working through a problem. The outer layer of it is holding, but the inner work is incomplete. They didn't finish it. Something interrupted them. Aldris said, from the chair she had taken by the fire. The Alpha King identified the nature of the audience and ended it before they had finished their ceremony. The woman, Sarah, looked at the mark again, not touching. There's a lock on it, old work, older than the seal, something that was already there. She looked up at me. Do you know what it is? I did not. She looked at Aldris. Aldris looked at the fire for a moment before she answered. There are old accounts, she said carefully, of the mate bond in Wolf Kings of this line. Some of them describe a mark, not the same as the seal, a different thing, a seal of another kind that forms at birth or early life and is specific to the wolf's fated mate. A resonance mark, the old word for it. It would be at the center of the chest. She paused. I always thought it was a story. Sora said, it's not a story. The room was very quiet again. I looked at Aldris, and she looked back at me with an expression that was doing several things at once, none of which she would have put into words in the presence of a stranger. I looked at the woman standing in the lamplight with salt in her hair and her coat still on, who had walked up the cliff path on foot and refused to be sent away, and was now standing in my receiving room telling me that underneath a Mooncult frost seal there was an older mark entirely, one that had been built into the bone of me before I was old enough to understand what it meant. You said, I said slowly, that you've never been wrong about the sea. She looked at me with her level dark eyes. I said that to your steward because he needed a reason to let me in. It's also true. A pause. I'm not always right about everything else. I found, despite everything, that this made me want to exhale. I had not met anyone in 3 years who was honest with me before they were reassuring. My counsel was reassuring as a primary strategy and honest as a distant backup. Aldris was honest, but she was also Aldris, which meant her honesty came organized and categorized and presented in order. This woman was honest the way the sea was honest, without arrangement, because it hadn't occurred to her to try it any other way. What does the outer practitioner's account say? I asked Aldris, the one who told you about the true mate's hand. Aldris folded her hands in her lap. She said the seal break requires a fated mate placing their palm flat on the mark and not pulling away. The seal will accept the bond or it won't. If it accepts, the mark releases and the bond completes. Both parties are bound. If it doesn't accept, nothing happens. Both parties are bound, I repeated. Yes. I looked at the woman standing in the lamplight. She was looking at the frost mark on my chest with an expression I couldn't immediately read, not calculation, not fear, something quieter than either. She was a packless woman who read tides and walked cliff paths in winter, and had talked her way past my steward with a sentence and a half. She had looked at my mark, and she had known about the resonance seal underneath the curse before Aldris had named it. She had not flinched when she came close to me. You should know, I said, what a completed bond means, before anything happens in this room. I know what a mate bond is, she said. Then you know it's not reversible. She met my eyes. I know. And you know that what Aldris described, placing your palm on the mark, is something you would do by choice, fully understanding what it means. Not because you were asked, not because you were paid, not because you were brought here and had no alternative. I stopped. My chest felt strange, not the usual cold strange, something else. If you walk out of this keep right now, Aldris will see that you have provisions for the journey and a horse if you need one. You owe this keep nothing. You owe me nothing. She was quiet for a moment. Is that what you want, she said, for me to leave? The frost in my chest, not the cold of it, but the weight, the 3-year weight that had made every morning a reckoning, shifted. Not vanished. Shifted. The way pack ice shifts on a warming current, the way it doesn't break yet but something underneath it has changed. No, I said. Aldris left the room. I did not ask her to. She simply stood, folded her hands once in the gesture that meant she had said what she had come to say and would speak again when she was needed, and went out through the door to the east passage and pulled it closed behind her. There was a quality to the closing of that door, a deliberateness, a care, that told me she had been waiting for some version of this moment for longer than she had let me know. Sara stood in the center of the room. The fire was burning a little better than it had been, or perhaps I only thought so because I was attending to it differently now. The way attention changes what you notice, how a detail that has been present all along becomes visible only when you're looking for it. She had taken her coat off while Aldris was gathering herself to leave, folded it over the back of a chair with the automatic tidiness of someone accustomed to taking care of their things, and putting them where they won't be lost. Underneath the coat she wore a wool dress in the same dark coastal colors, practical, unremarkable, exactly what a person who walked cliff paths in winter and needed their clothes to function would wear. She said, "Tell me about the day they came." I looked at her. "You've been carrying it for 3 years, she said. 3 years alone in a keep full of wolves who won't walk past your door if they can go around it. Tell me about the day they came." I had been told many things in this room by many people, in 3 years of attempts to fix what the moon cult had done to me. I had been told about seal mechanics and resonance frequencies and old wolf-tongue prayers, and the particular phase of moon under which a binding would be weakest. I had not been told to talk about the day itself. I had not in 3 years spoken about it to anyone. I sat down in the chair across from the one where she had put her coat. I told her about the day they came. I told it the way I would have told a tide chart entry. Plainly, in order, without the particular kind of editorializing that happens when you've been alone with something long enough for it to acquire a significance it didn't have when you lived through it. They had come under a peace delegation flag from the Myra coast, 3 priests and an academic, and a woman who had called herself a translator but had done most of the speaking herself. The audience had run 3 hours. The translator had done most of the talking about coastal rights, about territorial boundaries, about the trade routes that ran through Valdris's southern waters. It was not, from the outside, an unusual diplomatic meeting. The difficulty was the incense they had used. Not poison, My wolf had checked for poison and found nothing. But there was something in the smoke that had made the room feel heavier than it should, warmer than it should, until the warmth had become a kind of weight, and the weight had become a kind of acceptance. And when the translator reached across the table in what looked like a gesture of emphasis, and her hand landed on my chest where the mark was and pressed, I had felt it go in. I stopped talking. Sara was watching me from the window where she had moved at some point while I was speaking, her arms loose at her sides, the tide chart expression she wore when she was reading something and not yet done reading. The fire had died back again. The frost on the window above her left shoulder was very white in the lamplight. She said, "You ended the audience." "Yes." "Before they finished." "Before they finished," I confirmed. I don't know what made me move. The warmth weight should have held me longer than it did. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the resonance seal, the old mark underneath, it resisted being worked on. It created not a barrier exactly, a difficulty. It slowed them down enough that you could feel it go wrong and act. I looked at her. "You speak about it as if you know it." "I do know it," she said simply. "Not the way I know things I've learned, the way I know the tide signs, the way I knew what the frost pattern on your floor meant before anyone told me." She looked at her own hands for a moment. "I've been walking toward this coast for 2 years. I didn't know why. I don't always know why the current I'm following is the one I'm following. I just know when the pull is real." 2 years. She had been walking toward this coast for 2 years. The seal had been in my chest for 3. The cold weight in my chest cracked. I don't mean it lessened. It didn't, not yet. The frost was still there and the mark was still there, and the cold in the air was still wrong. But something inside the weight cracked, the way old ice cracks on the first genuinely warm day of a coastal spring, not breaking, but announcing that it is possible to break, that the thing you have believed is permanent is in fact subject to change. The sound that ice makes when it does that. I had not heard anything like it from inside my own chest in 3 years. I said, "You walked up the cliff path." "The road was faster, but I knew the path." "You came alone." "I travel alone." A pause. "I've always traveled alone. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly. I knew what I was following." I said very carefully, "You are not obligated to place your hand on that mark. What the mark might mean, what you might be, none of it obligates you to anything. I want to be precise about this." She looked at me with those level eyes, and for a moment she was simply looking, not answering, not moving. Then she said, "I know what it means if the seal accepts. I know it's permanent. I know you're a king and I don't have a pack, and I walked up here in a winter coat that's been to 4 coastlines and has patches on the elbows." She paused. "I'm not someone who walks away from a real pull because it's inconvenient." I was quiet. "Where is Aldris?" she said. Aldris came back with Seth, and Seth had brought 2 other members of the council, Draven, who had 26 years of opinions about everything, and a younger woman named Veth who handled territorial disputes and had the most organized mind in the keep after Aldris herself. I had not asked for a witness gathering. Aldris had apparently decided that whatever happened next should happen in front of people with the authority to recognize what they were seeing, and I found I did not disagree with her. They filed into the receiving room and arranged themselves with the particular care of wolves who are unsure of the situation and want their position in it to be defensible later. Seth stood nearest the door, which I recognized as the positioning of someone who wanted proximity to an exit. Draven stood with his arms folded, and his expression set in the mode that meant he was prepared to be critical, but was waiting for the development of events before committing to the specifics. Veth stood slightly apart from both of them with a writing cloth in her hand and a look of intense, interested attention. Sara stood in the center of the room and did not appear to notice any of them in particular. Draven looked at her, looked at me, and said, "This is the saltwater vagrant who your steward tried to send away." "Draven," Aldris said. I am noting for the record, Draven said, in the tone that meant he had already noted it internally, and was now noting it externally for the benefit of anyone who might later be compiling a record, that the attempt to break a moon cult binding is being made by a packless woman who arrived on foot, without introduction, without. Draven, I said. He stopped. Stand back, I said, and watch. He stood back. His expression was a masterwork of contained objection. I looked at Sara. She looked at me. I pulled the laces of my shirt loose again and drew the fabric away from the mark. In the lamplight, it looked darker than it did in daylight, darker and more wrong, the ridged ice texture of it visible even at the distance between us. She crossed the room to me without hurrying. She did not look at Draven or Seth or Veth or Aldris. She looked at the mark, and then she looked at my face, and I looked back at her. Still your choice, I said, quietly, so it was between us, not for the room. This moment and everyone after. She reached out and placed her palm flat against the mark. Nothing happened for one breath. Then everything happened. The warmth came from her palm like the warmth from a sea coal fire. Not gradually, the way warmth usually comes, spreading from a source and diffusing through a space, but suddenly, the way it comes when you have been cold for so long that you have forgotten there is a difference, and then the difference arrives all at once. It hit the center of my chest, and it kept going, not into the mark but through it, the way water goes through a fissure in rock, following paths the rock made available because it couldn't help itself, because the structure of the rock had always had these paths built into it, and the water simply revealed them. I felt the frost seal crack. Not a fracture. A shattering from the inside out, the way a frozen pipe shatters when the water inside it finds its temperature and expands. The crack went through the seal in every direction simultaneously, and I felt the pieces of it. The moon cult work, the 3-year wait, the specific wrong cold that had been making my candles die and my wolves flinch and my frost patterns reach toward every wall. I felt them losing their grip on the underlying structure of the mark, the one that was older than the seal, the one that had been built into me long before 3 priests and a translator had arrived with their incense and their diplomatic pretexts. Sara did not pull her hand away. The frost on the floor of the receiving room cracked. It cracked in one sound, a single report, like ice in a glass when you pour something warm over it, and then it was water on the black stone, spreading outward from where I stood and reflecting the lamplight in thin, moving ribbons. Seth made a sound. I heard Aldris make a different sound entirely. I did not look at any of them. I looked at the woman whose hand was still flat against my chest and at the mark beneath her palm. It was glowing. Not brightly, not the dramatic glow of fire or lightning. The glow of something relit, a coal that has been banked too long and is finding its heat again, a lampwick after the spark has taken, the particular quality of warm light that means something is alive that was very close to not being. The ridged ice texture of the seal had gone. What remained was a different mark, the older one, the resonance seal that Aldris had thought was a story, and it was warm, and the warmth was spreading from it up through my chest and into my throat and the backs of my hands and the soles of my feet. Sara made a small sound. I looked at her face. Her eyes were wide, not frightened, surprised, the way people are surprised by the thing they have half believed, and then believed all the way and then had confirmed so completely that the confirmation itself arrives as a shock. Her free hand, the one not pressed to my chest, moved to her own sternum, and I watched her press it there and hold it. The bond had landed in her. At the same moment, it had landed in me. Behind us, Draven said nothing. After a long time, Draven said nothing. I marked this. I took the coat from the back of the chair where she had folded it so carefully, and I settled it across her shoulders. She was still looking at the mark, glowing, warm, the wrong cold gone from it entirely, and her hand was still there, and I kept my hands at the edges of her shoulders without pulling her in, without taking anything that was hers to give and not mine to take. The lamp burned straight and tall. The fire in the hearth had caught, properly this time, fed by something in the room that had been absent for 3 years and was present again. Aldris was at the window. I heard her open the latch. From below, from the sea cliff, the tide. I heard it the way I had not heard it in 3 years. Not the winter tide's low groaning against frozen rock. Not the sound of something cold fighting something colder, but the full voice of the Valdres Sea in a north wind winter, which is not a quiet sound and is not a gentle one but is absolutely alive. The sound of something immense and honest and entirely without interest in anyone's fear of it. Sora heard it too. I felt her exhale under my hands, the slow, deep exhale of someone who has arrived somewhere after a very long walk and knows, in the body knowledge that precedes thought, that they are done traveling. Veth, who had been writing on her cloth and had not stopped writing throughout any of what had just happened, looked up and said, in the tone of someone who is completing a record and wants the record to be accurate, "The Alpha King's frost seal was broken at this hour on this day. The resonance bond between the Alpha King and the Tide Reader of the Southern Cove was confirmed by the mark's recognition and completion, witnessed by the High Priestess Aldris, the Steward Seth, Counselor Draven, and myself. All frost damage to the hall floors and walls to be assessed and noted separately." Draven said, in a voice that had lost something, the edge it always had, the 26 years of accumulated certainty, "the hall floors." "The hall floors," Veth confirmed. "The frost is gone, Draven." A long silence. In that silence I heard Draven, who had stood in my hall 8 months ago and enumerated the consequences of my refusing political matches, do something I had never heard him do in all the years he had served this keep. He cleared his throat. Then he said, addressing the room rather than anyone in it directly, "Well." I looked at the top of Sora's head. She had turned toward the window Aldris had opened, and the sea wind was coming in and moving through her already tangled hair. Below us the tide was coming in strong and loud over the black rocks of the Valdres cliff base, and she was listening to it with an attention that was not passive. She was reading it, even now, even standing in a receiving room in a king's keep with his coat over her shoulders and a bond newly completed in her chest. "What does it say?" I asked. She tilted her head. "The tide." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, reading. Then, "that the storm that's been sitting offshore for 2 weeks is going to pass north of us. We'll have clear water by morning." A pause. "It's been waiting." I thought about a storm that had been sitting offshore for 2 weeks, waiting for something it could not name, holding itself in the gray suspension between arriving and going, and then the thing it had been waiting for happened and it could go. "So have I said. She turned her head and looked at me, then she looked back at the tide. It took 3 days for the frost to fully leave the keep. Not all at once, the way the seal had broken all at once. The hall floor had cleared in that first hour. The water running into the channels the stone masons would later determine had been carved along the hall's perimeter by my grandfather in anticipation of the drainage needs of a coastal structure, as if he had known something might one day need to drain away. But the frost that had crept into the walls over 3 years retreated slowly, the way it had come, over days, in stages, the ice in the mortar cracking and releasing and the stone breathing again. The wolves noticed before the council did. My pack had learned over 3 years to conduct themselves at a distance from wherever I was, to use the outer corridors, to sit at the far end of a table, to take the sea air rather than the hall air when they had a choice. Old instincts are sticky things. They did not immediately come flooding back through the hall when the cold lifted, because they were not certain, yet, that the cold had actually lifted, and that this was not a temporary thing they should not allow themselves to rely on. They edged back in over the 3 days, a wolf stopping in the east corridor and then, instead of turning to go the long way around, continuing through the hall. 2 of the younger wolves choosing the hall fire in the evening over the outer courtyard braziers. The first morning I came down to the hall and found 3 wolves sitting together near the center hearth. just sitting, not doing anything in particular, just choosing to be in the same room as the warmth. I stood in the doorway and looked at them for a long moment and did not say anything. Sora found me there. She had been in the keep for 3 days, and she moved through it the way she had moved through the receiving room on the first day, without reference to where she was supposed to be, without asking what was expected of her, following whatever internal compass she followed in the same unhurried way she had walked up the cliff path. She stopped beside me and looked at the 3 wolves by the hearth. "They'll come back," she said. "They already are. The younger ones first, then the older ones who have more to unlearn." She tilted her head the way she did when she was reading something. "That one on the left is going to fall asleep in about 4 minutes. He's been awake since before dawn." I looked at the wolf on the left. He was a young male, perhaps 18, who had been my fastest runner for 2 years and had the habit of waking before dawn to run the cliff path and coming back exhausted and pretending he wasn't. He was sitting by the fire with his arms folded and his eyes at half-mast. "How do you know that?" I said. "He's been listening to the right for the last 2 minutes." She paused. "Tide reading is just a pattern reading. It's the same thing everywhere once you know how to look." The wolf on the left listed further to the right, caught himself, and listed again. The wolf next to him put a hand out without comment, and the listing wolf leaned against it and was asleep in approximately 4 minutes. I looked at Sora. She was watching them with an expression that had warmth in it. Not sentimentality, not performance, simply warmth. The way a lit room is warm, unremarkably and completely. "There is something," I said, "that I have not asked you." She waited. "You walked up a cliff path in winter without an introduction and talked your way past my steward with 1.5 sentences, and you came into my hall and told me about my own frost pattern before I had told you anything about it, and you placed your hand on a moon cult seal knowing what it meant if it accepted." I paused. "I have told you what this means for this keep and for this territory. I have not asked you what it means for you." She thought about this for a moment. "I've been walking for 2 years," she said. "I don't have a pack, which means I don't have a hearth, which means I've been sleeping on boats and in coves and in the occasional traveler's shelter when the weather required it. I read the sea because it's what I know how to do and it keeps me fed. I've been following a pull I couldn't explain to anyone, including myself, along a coastline for 2 years." She paused. "And now I'm standing in a hall that's warm again, watching a wolf fall asleep by a fire, and there's a current in my chest that feels like arriving." She looked at me. "That's what it means for me." Draven came through the hall behind us, paused when he saw us in the doorway, and then, after a moment that I observed with careful attention, continued past with his hands folded behind his back and said, without stopping, "The east wall assessors have finished. The frost damage to the mortar is minor, nothing that can't be repaired before spring tide." He paused once more, still not stopping, still moving away from us through the hall. "The hall is warmer than it was yesterday." He went through the far door. I looked at Sora. She was watching after him with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite something else, but was very definitely something. "Was that an apology?" she said. "From Draven," I said. "That was approximately 3 apologies." The High Priestess Aldris performed the formal mate bond acknowledgement in the Great Hall on the morning of the 5th day. Not the bond itself. The bond had already been acknowledged, by the mark and by the breaking of the seal and by the tide that had moved offshore in the night and left Valdris clear water. What Aldris performed was the public naming, the ritual that told the pack and the household and the territorial witnesses who had been quietly gathered from the neighboring holds that what had happened in the receiving room 5 days ago was real, confirmed, witnessed, and complete. The hall was full. Not the careful, strategic fullness of wolves who have decided that attendance is politically advisable. The fullness of a pack that had been finding its way back to its own hall for 5 days and was now here, all at once, because the hall was warm and the alpha was present, and those 2 facts together created a third fact, which was that this was the right place to be. The center hearths were burning fully and well. The candles on every table were burning at their full height. Frost Seth had ordered the hall floors cleaned, and the marks on the walls filled with fresh mortar, which had not yet dried but which already made the room look more like itself. Like the hall it had been before 3 years of wrong cold had changed the air of it. Sora stood beside me in front of Aldris. She was wearing the same wool dress she had arrived in, and her hair was still doing what it did in sea air, which was to arrange itself without reference to any particular standard. I had not asked her to wear anything different. I had, 3 days ago, asked Aldris whether this was something I should be addressing, and Aldris had looked at me with an expression that suggested the question did not require an answer, and I had taken the point. Aldris said the words of acknowledgement. They were old words, very old, the wolf-tongue phrases that recorded a mate bond in the pack's living memory. Not the words that created the bond, because the bond had already been created, but the words that said, "We have seen this, and we are witnesses to it, and this is the person, and here is her name, and she stands beside this alpha, and this is what that means in this territory and in this pack." Sora's name went into the record. She did not look particularly changed by the experience of hearing it said. She listened to it the way she listened to the tide, with full attention and without theater. When Aldris finished, Sora turned her head slightly and looked up at the High Priestess with the direct, level expression I had already come to recognize as her primary mode of engagement with the world, and said, "Thank you." Aldris, who was not a woman who was easily surprised, was very briefly surprised. Then she said, "Thank you," in return, in a way that meant something different than the words themselves, and turned back to the hall. The hall had been very quiet through the acknowledgement, the quality of quiet that a full room achieves when everyone in it is paying close attention. Now from the back came a sound. It was not a formal sound. It was not the acclamation that follows a crowning or a ceremony, that ordered sound, 3 beats, the pack voice in unison. It was something less organized and more honest than that. A low sound, building, the sound of a lot of wolves exhaling at once, of a room full of held breath releasing, of people who have been waiting for something to change finally feeling it change, and not quite believing it, and believing it completely at the same time. One of the older wolves near the back of the hall, a man who had been in Valdris since before I was king, who had served my father and remembered my grandfather, who had watched the frost creep across the floor for 3 years and had not said a word about it because there was nothing useful to say, sat down on the nearest bench and put his face in his hands. Not from grief, from the other thing. Draven, standing at the side of the hall with his arms folded, looked at the floor for a long moment. Then he looked up. I was looking at him. He knew I was looking at him. We looked at each other across the full hall and he gave me a nod, a single, deliberate, small nod, and I gave him one back. Sora was looking at the tide window. I had had it open that morning, the tall one on the east wall that faced the sea. The winter air came in off the cliff, cold and salted and entirely honest, and I stood in it without the wrong cold in my chest, just the ordinary cold of a coastal winter morning, the kind that has nothing in it except weather. "The tide is out," she said. "It'll come back," I said. "It always comes back," she looked at me. "That's the thing about tides. They're not going anywhere. They're just where they are, on the schedule they keep, because that's what tides do." I thought about the keep that had gone 3 years without warmth, and the hall that was full again, and the frost that had run off the floor in thin, clear ribbons, and a woman who had walked up a cliff path, because she was following a pull she could not explain, and had placed her hand flat on a Mooncult seal without flinching, and had changed the temperature of everything. I thought about the tide below the cliff, which was out now and would be back by mid-morning, which had no opinion about kings or seals or frost curses, and simply went about its business with the complete and unhurried commitment of something that has always known what it is. She was still watching the window, The sea wind moved through her hair. I did not say anything else. There was nothing to say that the tide wasn't already saying, below the cliff, in its own language, with the patience of something that has never once in its long life been wrong about when it was coming home.